May I speak to you in the name of God, who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen.
If you were here with us last weekend, and on top of that, you were paying attention to what was in the gospel. I know they don't always go together. Hopefully they do, but being realistic. You might notice that today's gospel lesson seems a little odd to follow up last week's gospel lesson. Because kind of the meat of the story is exactly the same as last week's. If you weren't here, or you don't remember, or you weren't paying attention, last week's gospel started off with Jesus asking the disciples, "Who do people say I am?" He said, "Oh, John the Baptist, Elijah, another one of the prophets." And then he asked them, "Well, what about you? Who do you say I am?" And Peter responds with the right answer. "You are the Messiah. You are the Christ." And then Jesus starts to teach them what it means for him to be the Messiah. Because as I said last week, they had an idea of what that meant already. They were already expecting a Messiah. And it's not what he has in mind. It's not the right idea. So he has to reshape what they're thinking. He has to replace that hope inside them and give them something new. So he tells them what we hear at the beginning of today's gospel lesson. I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to be tortured. I'm going to be killed. But I will rise again. So looking at it just from the lectionary, it seems kind of redundant. Maybe Jesus is getting forgetful. Remember, middle age for him was like 16 years old, so at 33. But that's just because we're only looking at it in the lectionary. I wouldn't expect any of you to remember chapter and verse numbers from last week, but it's a chapter behind. These don't immediately follow each other. Does anyone remember after Peter confesses Jesus is the Messiah? Does anyone remember what happens in the Gospels? Don't worry, no one knew at the last service. Well, yeah. But after all that, what's the next story that comes? It's not this. It's the Transfiguration. Jesus brings some of his disciples up with him up this mountain, and there's Elijah and Moses appearing and talking with Jesus. There's a bunch of stuff that happens between last week's gospel lesson and today's gospel lesson. It seems odd to us because we're getting that chapter-long jump. But in the actual gospel, it's not. I'm going to tell you this thing, I'm going to yell at you, and I'm going to tell you again. But other stuff happened. We don't hear about the Transfiguration this Sunday because we've already heard about it this year. It's always the reading at the end of the season after the Epiphany. And Transfiguration has its own feast day on August 6th, and if that falls on a Sunday, like it did last year, not this year, we get it on that Sunday. Some parishes, it's a major feast, so you might get an actual service on the Feast of the Transfiguration. So we don't hear about it today, not because it's not important, but because it could be the third time we've heard about it on a Sunday. So the lectionary jumps. It's not Jesus being forgetful or redundant. It's a jump in time. So don't let it seem odd to you and put you off because of that. He's going to continue. Spoiler alert, in another chapter, he does the same thing. Because as I said last week, there's some important work to be done in getting this message through to those disciples. They have their preconceived ideas of what it means to be the Messiah. They know it's him. But they're wrong about what it means for him and for them as his followers. So he really has to hammer it into them that this is what it means to be the Messiah. I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to die. But that's what I'm going to liberate you from. That's what I'm going to free you from. Not Rome. Not something as small as an earthly empire. But from sin and death itself. So he keeps hammering this idea into them over and over because it's that important. We have the luxury of 1,000 years history knowing how the story goes, so it seems unnecessary to us. but I'm pretty sure I can guarantee that if we were back there with them, we would need this message hammered in over and over and over again. Because we would have those same preconceived ideas that the disciples had. And we would react just like Peter, being like, no, you're wrong. That can't be it. This is what we want. This is what we're expecting. Jesus, knowing his time is coming, is getting them ready. Getting them set for when he is betrayed and murdered and no longer with them. So that they don't lose hope or lose faith. But that they understand what his mission really is. And it can become their mission. And they can join and continue the work that he started after he leaves. So that's just to clarify the time. There's another little misunderstanding I think that can happen with the way the lectionary splits it up. Because we heard them all together, and then they're still all together, and he teaches this to them again, and this time they still don't get it, but they just, I think, are still afraid after the rebuke of Peter not to say anything. So they keep quiet, and they go on arguing amongst themselves about who is the greatest. And I think it would be easy for us, reading it like this, to see the 12, or it says disciples, so it might not be just the 12, but a bigger group, all kind of arguing, making their case for why each one of them is the greatest. Remember, we have the transfiguration in between this. We have Jesus picking 3 of them and bringing them on this secret mission. Bringing them up the mountain and allowing them to see something, experience something that no one else does. So I don't imagine it as this group of 12 or more, or however many, making their cases for themselves. I imagine kind of all-stars forming among that group of disciples, and factions being made. Maybe Thomas getting behind Peter and arguing with Judas about how Peter is really the best of them, not John or James. That kind of thing happening. And it all feeding into each other. And I think that's an easy image for us to get. I think it's a story we all know. Think of pretty much any sports movie you've seen about an underdog team. That's what happens, right? There's too many, or not too many, there's a handful of mediocre to not so great players, and then just 1, 2, 3 really good players. And the real problems arise from those great players trying to make themselves greater, trying to put themselves forth as the greatest, and not being a real member of the team. As we heard in the letter to James, following selfish ambition and all the disorder and chaos and sin that comes from looking out for yourself and your status and where you fit above that of everyone else. And Jesus notices this. And keeping on with trying to get them ready as he's marching towards Jerusalem, as he's marching towards what we know to be Holy Week, to his passion, his death, and resurrection. He needs to stop this. He needs to get them ready, not just on board with the idea of what it means to be Messiah, but how and who they need to be for when he's no longer with them. So he stops them and he says, guys, if you want to be first, you need to be last of all. You need to be the servant of all. This isn't about one of you or 2 of you. This is about all of you acting together. St. Paul goes on in his writings later on to talk about how the church is the body of Christ. One body. We have different members, and those different members have different jobs and orders and all that. But it's still one body, and every part is important. That's what Jesus is getting at here. Stopping them from trying to create those few all-stars who they line up behind and pit against each other. Do you guys remember the movie Major League? About the Cleveland Indians and how they're just not a great team at that time, and the owner wants to sell them, so kind of keeps trying to pit them up to do their worst so she can sell them and move them and be free of them. They've got a ton of just awful players. And then they've got a couple good players who have some big problems, and they've got one really good all-star player, Roger Dorn. I think his last name's Dorn, I can't remember. I looked it up this morning, I don't remember very well. But the problems come from them not gelling as a team. Because Dorn, that third baseman, who's a really good player, is just looking out for him and his future, seeing the writing on the wall, knowing that he is the best of them. And then they've got a great, fast outfielder who just can't hit, but is faster than anyone. And he's all concerned about himself. And then Charlie Sheen, I can't remember the character, Rick Vaughn, what's his character's name? Wild Thing Rick Vaughn. Can throw so fast, it turns out later in the movie, he can't really see, so he's all over the place. Wild Thing was making fun of him because the balls went everywhere. All these players are either background and not that great, or the good ones have their own problems and are looking out just for themselves, trying to make a name for themselves, worried about who is the greatest and making sure it's me. And the team doesn't start to do well until they get past all of that, until they realize what's happening with the owner, and they come together as a team and see beyond themselves and start to play as a team, start to play as one body. This story, we know it, we see it all around us. How many of you have heard the phrase, there are too many cooks in the kitchen, right? We know this idea, where we think we know what's best. We think we're the best, or someone else thinks they know what's best, or that they're the best. And they try to control everything, and it doesn't work. And Jesus recognized that this was happening for his disciples, and said, no. You guys aren't the cooks. You're the waiters. The word here that he uses for servant, usually the word, when servant is mentioned, is the same word as slave. Someone who's completely obedient to someone else. Here, it's the word that we get deacon from. And deacons were the table servants. They were the folks who waited tables, who made sure that others had their food, who others had their needs met before they were able to meet their own. Jesus tells us here that it's not about being an all-star. It's not about being the best, the greatest. But it's about being part of this body and serving all. Seeing to the needs of everyone else, not just ourselves. Elsewhere in the Gospels, he tells us that if you really want to follow him, the two things you've got to worry about are loving God with everything you have and loving your neighbor as yourself. Being this type of servant. Seeing to everyone's needs, not just yours. Lifting up the whole body, not just your part. That's what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. Do you guys remember when Randy Moss played for the Patriots? He was setting records all over the place. And after setting one record, he was being interviewed afterwards. And I looked for it this week and I couldn't find it. If you Google Tom Brady and Randy Moss, a lot of stuff comes up, surprisingly. But he was asked about it, and he had every opportunity to talk about how great he was, which he did a lot. He wasn't the most modest of people. But at this point, and breaking whatever record this was, or whatever it was a while ago, so I might not remember it exactly. But his response wasn't about him and how great he was. His response was, well, when you've got Tom Brady throwing you the ball, it's not that difficult to do. He could have lifted himself up. He could have been playing just for himself. But at least in that moment, he recognized he was a part of a team. That's what Jesus is telling the disciples here. None of them are to do everything. None of them are to be the greatest, the first among them all. But following him, following the Messiah, the Christ that he is, their lives are to be marked by love. Love for God and love for their neighbor. And if you're really going to love God and your neighbor, you can't just be looking out for yourself. You can't just be concerned with your status, with what people think about you or what you're doing. But you need to really care for and see to the needs of that neighbor. And elsewhere, as we know, he sets that definition of neighbor very, very wide. If we're really to follow him, the type of Messiah he is, we are to love and to care for and to see to the needs of all of those around us. Amen.